So, a summary of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 starts where we've just finished at the end of Chapter 7, which is that the Germans have arrived in Nice. So, the Joffo family are getting used to the new situation. Chapter 8 starts on page 229, and straight away we feel the German presence. La Gestapo s'est installée depuis 3 jours à l'hôtel Excelsior. La plupart des hôtels ont été réquisitionnés. Le commandanteur se trouve place Masséna et des rafles ont eu lieu. So we learn that the Gestapo have moved in. They've started taking control of all the buildings. They've made one of the main hotels their headquarters, and they have started rounding up Jews, which was what the family have managed to avoid so far. On the following page, page 230, Henri and Albert, who've been out cutting people's hair, come back and report that they have heard German soldiers talking about arresting Jews. At the bottom of page 230, we have these reference to des convois spéciaux vers les camps allemands. Ce sont des wagons scellés qui sont prioritaires. Rester ici, c'est prendre un billet pour l'Allemagne. So, to stay here, you might as well buy yourself a one-way ticket to Germany. And following that, with everything else that's happening, the family decide that they have to split up again. Henri and Albert are sent off to Savoy, and it's decided that Jo and Maurice are going to go to a camp called Moisson Nouvelle. The Moisson Nouvelle is a little bit like a Hitler Youth camp. It was flying the banner of the Compagnon de France, which was the Vichy government's version of Hitler Youth. And it is seen as a safe place. In fact, later on in the chapter, somebody comments that a Compagnon de France camp is probably the last place that you would look for the Jews. So the boys are sent off to Moisson Nouvelle, and they are under the guardianship of Monsieur Subinagui, who is very much an ally and ends up being their saviour. If we look at page 234, there is a reference from Jo, the author, right at the top of the page. Il n'y a donc pas à hésiter, sécurité avant tout. Security before everything. So the boys are very happy to be at the camp. And on the following page, just when they've met Subinagui, he makes a reference to the fact that votre papa m'a parlé de vous. Your dad told me all about you. Je crois qu'ici vous serez bien et en sûreté. So, although they never actually say the word Jewish out loud, it's very clear that Subinagui knows what he's dealing with. He's looking after the boys and he's keeping them safe. So the boys move to this camp, and straight away, Jo strikes up a friendship with a character called Ange Testi. And Ange is a French Algerian. His story becomes important to the boys because they decide to adopt this story as their own. So we see that on page 238, the boys are talking about people in the camp. And it's interesting because Jo asks him, c'est bien ici? Is everything all right here? Is it a good place to be? And Ange's reply is, c'est l'idéal, il y a beaucoup de juifs. There's lots of Jews here. Which, of course, was the last thing that Jo was expecting to hear. But his response is, t'es pas juif, toi? You're not Jewish, are you? Non? Et toi? And Ange's response to this is, pas de danger, no chance. I've been baptised, I've done my catechism, I've done my Catholic confirmation, and so on. And he tells Jo this story of how he arrived in France. So he came to visit a cousin in Paris, was staying with him when war broke out. And after a while, this cousin decided to get married. And because he got married, he threw Ange out. And Ange was on the street begging for a little while. Eventually, he's made his way down to Nice and he's met Subinagui. And Monsieur Subinagui has also offered to provide a shelter for Ange in his camp. So we learn about Ange's story. The important thing is that Ange grew up in Algeria. And at this point, Algeria was under the control of the Free French and the Allies. So any story that related to Algeria, the Gestapo, the Nazis, would have no way of checking that because they didn't have that line of communication open. And you can read about his story on page 239. Shortly after Joe and Maurice are deciding what they're going to do at the camp, they have a very brief session at a pottery camp. They don't want to be separated, so they go there together, but turns out they're not so great at it. And they come back to Moisson Nouvelle and they work in the kitchens. Following on from this, Maurice, who's had a little chat with Monsieur Subinagui, suggests to Joe that they create a new identity. So we're up to about page 250 by now. And about halfway down the page, we see Maurice saying to Joe, "Écoute, Subinagui m'en a parlé. Aujourd'hui, la Gestapo ne cherche même plus à faire des enquêtes. Mais si on leur dit qu'on s'appelle Joffo, que papa a un magasin rue de Clignancourt, c'est-à-dire en plein quartier juif de Paris, ils n'iront pas chercher plus loin." So he's had this conversation with Subinagui, who has said and made him realise that as soon as they see your surname is Joffo, that your dad has a shop in this really Jewish area of Paris, they're not going to look much further. They're going to arrest you as Jews. So between the boys, they agree that they're going to take on most of Ange's story as their own. And they agree that the general information, that they were born in Algeria, that they came over for a holiday, that's the reason why they're here, they're going to stick to that line. But the finer detail, such as the name of the road they live on, Rue Jean Jaurès, they're going to use their details from Paris. And Maurice says, well, why would we do that? And Joe's response is, well, there's a Rue Jean Jaurès in every street, so it's a really easy one to get away with. So we see Joe becoming more aware of the situation, a little bit more sournois, a little bit more devious. So the boys agree this backstory, which is very, very important given what's to come in the next chapter. There's also references to the fact that Subinagui is very much on their side. On page 254, Joe questions why he would help them. He says, Subinagui a nos papiers, il sait d'où nous venons, et si les Schleux se renseignent, il sera bien forcé de leur dire. So les Schleux is a slang word for the Germans. He's got our papers. Subinagui has our papers. He knows where we're from. And if the Germans ask him about it, he will be forced to tell them. But Maurice's response is, ce type nous aidera. This guy will help us. So Maurice is putting a huge amount of trust in Subinagui, which turns out to be well placed. So the boys are still at Moisson Nouvelle, and then on page 254, one fateful day, Ferdinand, who's an older boy at the camp, says to them, I'm going into Nice for the day. Do you want to come with me? Vous venez avec moi, les Joffos? And they decide to go. When they go to Nice for the day, they get into the city and Ferdinand says to them, right, I'm just going to go see a friend for a few minutes on the Rue de Russie. Wait for me 2 minutes and I'll be out. And the boys wait, and they wait, and they wait. And eventually, Maurice gets a little bit fed up and he says, do you know what? I'm going to go in. So, off he goes. And he says to Joe, don't follow me. I'm going to go and check on him. And Joe waits and he waits. And Maurice doesn't come back. So Joe decides that he's also going to follow Maurice and Ferdinand into this inner courtyard. And this takes us onto page 260. So Joe has just walked in. Le meurtre se jette sur moi. The wall throws itself on top of me. Very odd phrase. But what we understand from this is that Joe's been attacked and he feels like the whole world's caving in on him. And we have this description of somebody leaning over him. Il se penche, il sent la cigarette. So he's hanging over me. He smells of cigarettes. Sa main me serre le bras. So his arm gets hold of me. And we hear these words being spoken. Yud, dit-il, yud. So yid. And we learn from the description that follows on that it's a German soldier and that essentially all the boys have fallen into a trap. On page 261, Joe has been taken into the room where Maurice and Ferdinand already are. C'est ma faute, chuchote Ferdinand. On est tombé dans une souricière. We fell into a trap. Il y avait ici un centre de résistance qui fournissait des faux papiers. So there was a resistance group working out of here doing false papers. And the boys don't understand at first. They say to Ferdinand, well, what were you doing here? You don't need papers. What were you trying to escape for? And eventually Ferdinand says to them, well, actually, I'm Jewish. That's why I was trying to escape. But then he turns to the boys, and on page 262, he says, mais qu'est-ce que tu vas leur dire? C'est pas bien grave pour vous. Quand ils sauront que vous n'êtes pas juif, ils vont vous relâcher. So it's not such a serious thing for you, because when they realise that you're not Jewish, they will release you. So even Ferdinand, who's gone along and is admitting now that he's Jewish, hasn't realised that Joe and Maurice are both Jewish themselves, because they've hidden their identity so well. And the three of them sit in this room with some women who've also fallen into the trap. And they sit there for a few hours before eventually they're loaded onto a lorry and taken to the Hotel Excelsior, which is, as we learnt at the start of the chapter, the headquarters of the Gestapo. And that's how chapter 8 ends, that Joe and Maurice get out of this wagon. Je suis dehors en plein soleil et je n'ai pas de peine à me reconnaître. So I'm stood in full sunlight and I know exactly where I am. En face de moi, c'est l'Hôtel Excelsior, le siège de la Gestapo niçoise, the headquarters of the Nice Gestapo. So we know from the ending of this chapter that the boys are in serious trouble now. So the main themes, again, lots of references to the war. The seriousness of the war, because now the boys are no longer in the free zone, they're in another occupied zone. There are references to les rafles, the roundups. There are references to homes and hotels being requisitioned to put up German soldiers. There's also, within this idea of war, this irrational hatred that some of the German soldiers are showing for Jews. And we saw this in chapter 3, when the soldiers walked into the salon and they say, oh, la guerre, c'est la faute des Juifs. It's the Jews' fault, the war, even though they can't really justify why. We have a little bit more of that reference to this irrational hatred and not understanding the war. First of all, we've got the attitude of the German soldier, but then we've got the thoughts of Joe, perhaps as a child, perhaps as an adult, on page 265. He says, ce que je comprends le moins, c'est la violence de ce soldat. So what I understand the least is the violence of this soldier. On ne s'est jamais vu. We've never seen each other. Je ne lui ai rien fait et il veut me tuer. I've done nothing to him and he wants to kill me. So we've got this, what is the point of war? What could possibly have caused this hatred? We've also, obviously, in this chapter, got a huge theme of identity and the denial of the Jewish identity, because at this point, nobody has any idea, including those people who are in really close proximity to them, that they are Jewish. So Ferdinand who himself is Jewish and has taken the boys to Nice for the day, has no idea that the boys are also hiding at Moisson Nouvelle like he has been. Similarly, they don't admit to Ange or any of their peers in the camp that they're Jewish, even though they've learned that there are probably lots of Jewish boys hiding out there. Another theme that comes up in this topic is the closeness of the brothers, because they don't want to be separated at any point. They go to Moisson Nouvelle together. And actually, the reason that they both go and do pottery is because Joe says that he wants to do it first. So Maurice says, well, I'll go too. And as soon as one of them discovers that they're really bad at it, they both leave the pottery and go back to work in the kitchens together. So we've got this fraternité, the solidarité, the proximité of their relationship, how it's really important for them to be together. So even though the rest of the family has had to separate, the two boys are staying together through it all. Okay, and that's how we end this chapter, with the boys stood outside the Hotel Excelsior, about to go into the Gestapo headquarters.